Chapter 1. Iris, Marle. Marle was thinking about her sister, Rosemary Barton. For nearly a year she had tried to forget the blue face, the twisted fingers. The difference between that and the lovely, happy Rosemary of the day before. Well, perhaps not happy. She had been ill. She was tired and depressed. That's why she had killed herself, wasn't it? But last night, Rosemary's husband, George Barton, had called her into his study and shown her those letters. And now she had to remember the past. Pictures came into her mind, herself as a small child, eating bread and milk, and Rosemary, 6 years older, doing schoolwork at a table. Rosemary going to boarding school and coming home for the holidays. Rosemary going to live in Paris and coming home an elegant, beautiful woman with red gold hair and dark blue eyes. Rosemary's life became full of late breakfasts in bed, lunches with girlfriends and evening dances, while Iris still went to school, walked in the parks, ate supper at 9 o'clock and was in bed by 10, and then Rosemary had married George Barton. Iris still wondered why. So many exciting young men had been courting her, while George Barton was 15 years older than herself, kind, pleasant, and extremely dull. It wasn't money. Rosemary already had Uncle Paul's money. Paul Bennett wasn't really an uncle. He had been in love with their mother, but she had chosen another poorer man, Hector Marle. Paul had accepted his defeat and remained a family friend. He had become known as Uncle Paul and was godfather to Rosemary. When he died, he left his entire fortune to his 13-year-old goddaughter. So why had the rich and beautiful Rosemary married boring George Barton? She hadn't loved him, but she had been happy with him and was very fond of him. A year later, Iris and Rosemary's mother, Viola Marle, had died. Their father, Hector, had died many years before, and so, at the age of 17, Iris went to live with Rosemary and George in Elveston Square. Iris had not seen much of her sister in those days. Rosemary was always out shopping or going to parties, but she had seemed happy enough until that day, a week before it happened, when Iris had entered Rosemary's sitting room to find her sitting at her desk and weeping bitterly. Iris had never seen Rosemary cry before. It frightened her, although Rosemary had been ill with influenza and she knew that it could leave you depressed. "Rosemary, what's wrong?" she cried. Rosemary wiped her tear-stained face. "Nothing," she said angrily. Then she stood up and ran out of the room. Puzzled, Iris walked over to the table and saw her own name on a page of notepaper. Rosemary had been writing to her. She read the note. "Darling Iris, there isn't any point in making a will because my money goes to you anyway, but I'd like some of my things to be given to particular people. To George, the jewelry he's given me. To Gloria King, my cigarette case. To Maisie." The note stopped there. What did it mean? Rosemary wasn't going to die. She had been very ill, but she was better now. "My money goes to you anyway." Iris had always thought Uncle Paul's fortune would go to George if Rosemary died, but it said here that the money would come to her instead. That did make things rather less unfair. She was surprised by the thought. Had she felt it was unfair for Rosemary to get all Uncle Paul's money? Perhaps deep in her heart she had. Rosemary always had everything. parties, pretty dresses, young men in love with her, and an adoring husband. Iris picked up the unfinished letter and put it safely away in one of the drawers of the desk. After the fatal birthday party, it was used to prove that Rosemary had been depressed after her illness and might have been considering suicide. Depression after influenza was the verdict given at the inquest. Now Iris wondered how she had not been able to see the truth. After Rosemary's funeral, the family lawyer had explained the details of Paul Bennett's will to Iris. Rosemary had inherited his fortune, and she was meant to pass it on to her own children when she died. But if she died childless, the money would go to Iris when she reached the age of 21 or when she got married. George invited Iris to continue living with him. He suggested that her aunt, Mrs. Lucilla Drake, should also come and live with them. Mrs. Drake had very little money of her own because her son spent it all, and so she was very pleased by George's invitation. Iris had happily agreed to the arrangement. George treated her like a younger sister, and Mrs. Drake, who was a rather silly woman, let her do just as she pleased. The new household settled down comfortably together. 6 months after Rosemary's death, Iris had gone up into the attic of the house to look for a favourite jumper, which was packed away in a suitcase of unused clothes. Searching through the suitcase, she found an old robe that had belonged to Rosemary and felt something in one of the pockets. She reached into the pocket and pulled out a letter in Rosemary's handwriting. Darling, I know you don't mean it. We love each other. We can't just say goodbye. We belong together forever and ever. I don't care what people say. Love matters more than anything. You once said that life was nothing without me. And now you say that our relationship must end. But I can't live without you. Can't. George will understand that it isn't right to live together if you don't love each other anymore. We'll be wonderfully happy, darling, but we must be brave. I shan't tell George until after my birthday. Oh, darling. The letter ended here. So Rosemary had had a lover, and she had planned to go away with him. Who was this unknown man? Did he love Rosemary as much as she loved him? He must have done, and yet he had suggested ending it. Was he tired of her? It seemed that he had wanted to end the affair, but that Rosemary had disagreed. Rosemary had had many admirers, but there had been no one special, had there? Iris frowned. Could it have been Stephen Faraday? People said he was a brilliant politician, a possible future prime minister. Was that the attraction? Surely Rosemary couldn't really have loved such a cold, unemotional man. But it must be Stephen Faraday, because if it wasn't, it had to be Anthony Brown. And Iris didn't want it to be Anthony Brown. Anthony had been devoted to Rosemary, but he had disappeared after her death, and no one had seen him since. Of course, he travelled a lot. He had mentioned South America, Canada, Uganda, and the USA. Iris thought he was actually American, although his accent was very slight, and there was no reason why he should have continued to visit the rest of them. He was Rosemary's friend, after all. But Iris didn't want him to have been Rosemary's lover. That would hurt terribly. She wanted to throw the letter away, but something stopped her from doing it. One day it might be necessary to show someone that letter, to explain why Rosemary killed herself. So instead she took it downstairs and locked it in her jewellery box. Rosemary had died in November. In May, Iris, assisted by her Aunt Lucilla, had entered London's social world. She went to lunches, teas and dances, but she didn't enjoy them very much. It was at a rather boring dance at the end of June that she had heard someone behind her say, "Iris Marle." She had turned round and looked straight into Anthony Brown's handsome face. "You probably don't remember me," he said. "But—" "Of course I do," she smiled. "Oh, that's splendid. It's been such a long time since I saw you." "I know. Not since Rosemary's birthday party." She stopped in distress. Rosemary's birthday party. Rosemary's suicide. She wouldn't think of it. She would not. "I'm terribly sorry," he said quickly. "I shouldn't have reminded you." Iris swallowed hard. "It's all right. Please forgive me. Shall we dance?" She nodded and floated onto the dance floor in his arms. "Where have you been all this time?" she heard herself asking. "Travelling, on business." "I see. So, why have you come back now?" He smiled. "To see you, Iris Marle." Since then, Iris had seen Anthony at least once a week. She walked with him in the park, sat next to him at dinner parties, danced with him, but he never came to Elveston Square, always cleverly managing to avoid accepting her invitations. She began to wonder why. Was it perhaps because he and Rosemary had been lovers there in the past? Then one day, George had suddenly questioned her about the relationship. "Who's this Anthony Brown you're seeing?" he asked. "What do you know about him?" She stared at him in surprise. "Tony. He was a friend of Rosemary's." George blinked. "Oh, yes, of course he was. Well, you should be careful of the fellow. You're a very rich young woman, you know." "Tony has plenty of money," she cried angrily. "Why, he's staying at Claridge's Hotel." George smiled. "Very respectable and expensive. All the same, my dear, nobody knows much about him. He doesn't come to this house, does he?" "No. And I can see why if you're so horrid about him." "I'm simply warning you. I'll talk to Lucilla." George did mention Anthony Brown to Aunt Lucilla, but she did not pay much attention to him at the time because her attention was focused on a telegram from her beloved son in Rio de Janeiro. "Can you send me £200?" it said. "Life or death. Victor." "Victor knows I don't have much money, so he wouldn't ask for help unless it was an emergency. I'm so afraid he'll shoot himself. I would never forgive myself if I didn't do what he asked." George sighed. "I'll find out exactly what sort of trouble Victor's in. But you should let him try to get out of trouble by himself, Lucilla. He'll never take any responsibility for himself otherwise." "You're cruel, George. The poor boy has always been unlucky." George kept his thoughts about Victor to himself and decided to ask his efficient secretary to deal with it. He simply said, "I'll get Ruth to send a telegram at once. We should know by tomorrow." The £200 was eventually reduced to 50, which George paid himself. Iris told George how much she admired his kindness. "Well, there's always one loser in the family," he said, "who must be supported by the others. But Victor isn't your family. Couldn't I do it? You're always saying how rich I am." He smiled. "Not until you're 21. and I hope you won't do it then. But I'll give you one piece of advice. When someone threatens to end his life unless he gets £200 at once, £20 will usually be enough, and 10 will do. You can always cut down the amount. Victor would never kill himself. The people who threaten suicide never do it. Never. What about Rosemary? Thought Iris. Since Rosemary's death, George seemed older and heavier. He had grown increasingly absent-minded and spent a lot of time deep in thought. Something serious seemed to be worrying him. Iris sometimes noticed him staring at her with a puzzled look on his face. Then he started returning early from work and going straight into his study. She had followed him in there one afternoon and found him sitting at his desk, staring into space. When she asked him what the matter was, he replied quickly, "Nothing." As time went on, he began to ask peculiar questions such as, "Iris, did Rosemary ever talk to you?" "Of course, George." "About what?" "Oh, herself, her friends, whether she was happy, that sort of thing." Iris was afraid that George had found out about Rosemary's affair, but she didn't want to hurt him, and Rosemary had never said anything, so she shook her head. "Oh, well, it doesn't matter," he sighed. Another day he asked her who Rosemary's best friends had been. "Gloria King and Maisie Atwell," she replied. "Would she have told her secrets to them?" "I don't know." "What sort of secrets do you mean?" "Well, was she afraid of anybody? Did she have any enemies?" Iris stared at him in astonishment and his face reddened. "I just wondered." The next day he asked her how well Rosemary knew the Faradays. "I really don't know, George, but she was interested in politics. Only after she met the Faradays in Switzerland. She never thought about political matters before that. I think Stephen Faraday got her interested in the subject." What did Sandra Faraday think about that? She might resent him having a friendship with another woman. Iris felt uncomfortable. "Perhaps," she agreed. George suddenly changed the subject. "Are you still seeing Anthony Brown?" "Yes." "Isn't his business something to do with armaments?" "He has never said." "Well, he certainly spent a lot of time with Lord Dewsbury last year, and Dewsbury is the chairman of United Arms Limited. Rosemary saw a lot of Brown too, didn't she? He took her dancing." "Yes." "I was surprised that she wanted him at her birthday party, though. She hadn't known him for long." "He dances very well." A picture of the fatal party at the Luxembourg restaurant flashed across Iris's mind. The round table, the soft lights, the 7 guests. Herself, Anthony, Rosemary, Stephen Faraday, Ruth Lessing, George and Stephen's wife, Lady Alexandra, known to her friends as Sandra. That was the first time Iris had met Tony properly. Before then, he had just been a name, a shadow in the hall waiting to escort Rosemary out to yet another party. She pulled her mind back into the present to hear George saying, "Well, do ask Brown to dinner one night, my dear. I'd like to meet him again." Iris was delighted. She gave George's invitation to Tony and he accepted. But on the day of the dinner, he suddenly had to leave London on a business matter and couldn't come after all. In July, George announced that he had bought a house called Little Priors in the Sussex countryside. "Will it need decorating?" asked Mrs. Drake. "Oh, Ruth is arranging all that for us." Ruth Lessing, George's efficient secretary, was pleasant and good-looking in a hard black and white kind of way. George was devoted to her and relied on her completely. Lucilla Drake was annoyed. "George, dear, women do like to arrange the colour scheme of their own drawing room." George looked upset. "I wanted it to be a surprise." "I'm sure Ruth will have made it perfect," said Iris. "She's so clever. What shall we do down there? Is there a tennis court?" "Yes, and it's only 14 miles to the sea, and we'll have neighbours we know too. The Faradays own a house nearby." They spent most of August and September in Sussex. Little Priors was a handsome house, tastefully furnished and decorated. Visitors came to stay at the weekends. There were tennis parties and dinners with the Faradays. Sandra Faraday introduced them to the rest of their neighbours and advised George about buying horses. Stephen was often away in London, working on political business. Iris suspected that he was deliberately avoiding the family at Little Priors. The household had returned to London in October, and Iris had hoped that perhaps George would start behaving normally again. But then, late last night, he had knocked on her bedroom door and asked her to come into his study for a talk. Half asleep, she had agreed. Downstairs in the study, he invited her to sit down. "Is anything the matter, George?" she asked, as he lit a cigarette with a shaking hand. He looked really ill. "I can't go on alone. You must tell me if you think it's possible." He rubbed his hand over his face. "You'll understand when I've shown you these." He handed Iris 2 neatly printed letters. The first one said, "Your wife didn't commit suicide. She was killed." The second said, "Rosemary was murdered." "They came about 3 months ago," George continued. "At first I thought it was a cruel joke, but then I began to think, why would Rosemary have killed herself? Lots of people have influenza and feel a bit depressed afterwards, but Rosemary wouldn't kill herself just because she was unhappy. She might threaten to, but she wouldn't actually do it." "But what other explanation could there be, George? They found the cyanide poison in her handbag." "I know, but ever since these letters came, I've been thinking about it, and I believe they're true. That's why I asked you if Rosemary had enemies, or was afraid of anyone. Whoever killed her must have had a reason. And you must help me find out, Iris. You've got to remember that night in every detail, because if she was killed, you see, the murderer must have been sitting at that table." Chapter 2. Ruth Lessing. Ruth Lessing, a well-dressed, dark-haired woman of 29, was devoted to George Barton. When she had first come to work for him, 6 years ago, at the age of 23, she had discovered that he was a very disorganized and inefficient man. Being a businesslike young woman, she had immediately taken control of his affairs. She had saved him time and money, chosen his friends, and advised him on his business decisions. George, Rosemary, and Iris all called her Ruth, and she spent a lot of time with them at the house in Elveston Square. Last year, in early November, not long before Rosemary's death, George had spoken to Ruth about Victor Drake. "I want you to do a rather unpleasant job for me, Ruth," he said one morning. She nodded. "My wife's cousin, Victor Drake, is a very bad man. He has ruined his mother, Lucilla, who has given him almost all her savings. He was caught forging a cheque while he was at Oxford University and the family sent him abroad. He has travelled all over the world, but he never makes a success of anything he does. He's in London at the moment and has written to ask for money. I've made an appointment to meet him at 12 o'clock today at his hotel, and I want you to go in my place. I believe the matter can be kept absolutely businesslike if it's managed by a third person. What do you want me to offer him? £100 in cash and a ticket to Buenos Aires. The money will be given to him as he gets on the boat. Ruth smiled. You want to be sure he actually leaves. Indeed. Are you sure you don't mind doing this for me? Of course not. Here's his ticket. I've booked him onto the San Cristobal, which sails from Tilbury Docks tomorrow. Ruth put the ticket into her handbag. Where do I meet him? At the Rupert Hotel, Russell Square. My dear, what would I do without you? George put a hand on her shoulder affectionately. You're the kindest, dearest girl in the world. Victor Drake was a very attractive man, but Ruth could sense the cold, calculating personality hidden beneath his obvious charm. He greeted her with delight. So you're George's messenger. What a wonderful surprise. Coolly she made George's offer, and Victor agreed to the deal at once. £100? Not bad. I would have taken 60, but don't tell George. And who's coming to see me off on the San Cristobal? You, my dear. How delightful. His dark eyes smiled in his sunburned face. You've been with Barton for 6 years, haven't you, Miss Lessing? And he wouldn't know what to do without you. Oh, yes. I know all about you, my dear. How do you know? Asked Ruth sharply. Victor grinned. Rosemary told me. Rosemary? She was very nice to me. She gave me £100, actually. He laughed. Although she disapproved of his bad behaviour, Ruth found herself laughing too. That's too bad of you, Mr. Drake. Not at all. I'm a professional beggar with an excellent technique. My mother, for example, will always send money if I send a telegram suggesting suicide. You should be ashamed of yourself. Oh, I am. I'm a bad man, Miss Lessing. But I do enjoy myself greatly. I've lived a very interesting life. I've been an actor, a shopkeeper, a waiter, a builder, a porter, and a circus assistant. I stood for president in a South American republic. I've been in prison. And I've never done an honest job or paid my own bills. Ruth knew she should be horrified. But Victor Drake managed to make evil seem amusing. And you're not so good yourself, Ruth. He was looking at her closely now. You worship success. George shouldn't have married that little fool Rosemary. He would have done much better to marry you. Rosemary's lovely, but she's got no brains at all. She's the kind of woman that men always fall in love with, but never stay with. Now well, if a man fell in love with you, he would never grow tired of it. But George wouldn't fall in love with me, she cried. Oh, Ruth, if anything happened to Rosemary, George would marry you at once. You know that as well I do. You could twist him round your little finger. It's true, thought Ruth, suddenly very angry. If it weren't for Rosemary, I could make George marry me. Victor was watching her with amusement. He enjoyed putting ideas into people's heads, or showing them the ideas that were already there. Soon after Ruth returned to work that afternoon, Rosemary had called her on the telephone. "Oh, Ruth," she said, "Colonel Race won't be here in time for my party, so ask George who he would like to invite instead. We need another man. There are 4 women coming. Iris, Sandra Faraday, and I can't remember the other one. I'm the 4th. You very kindly asked me." "Oh, of course, I'd forgotten." Rosemary laughed and ended the call. At that moment, Ruth Lessing realized that she hated Rosemary Barton, hated her for being rich and beautiful and careless and brainless. She didn't need to work in an office. Everything had been handed to her on a golden plate. Love affairs, a devoted husband. "I wish you were dead," Ruth said to the silent telephone. Chapter 3. Anthony Brown. Anthony Brown knew he had been a fool to get involved with Rosemary Barton. After all, he wasn't staying at Claridge's Hotel for pleasure, he was in London to work. But Rosemary was beautiful enough to excuse the fact that he was neglecting his business affairs for a little while. Luckily, his fascination with her soon began to fade, and he knew that it wasn't love after all. But they could still have a good time together. Rosemary danced wonderfully, and whenever they went out, other men turned round to stare at her. It was very pleasant, as long as you didn't want to talk to her. She couldn't even listen intelligently, but he had taken her out, danced with her, kissed her in taxis, and was on the way to making a bit of a fool of himself over her, until that incredible day. He remembered the expectant look in her dark blue eyes as she said softly, "Anthony Brown is a nice name." "It's very respectable," he replied lightly. "There was an advisor to King Henry VIII called Anthony Brown. But you must be from the Italian branch of the family." "Because of my brown skin. I had a Spanish mother." "Oh, that explains it, Mr. Anthony Brown. You're very fond of my name," he laughed. "Well, it's nicer than Tony Morelli." He couldn't believe it. He caught hold of her arm. "Where did you hear that name?" His voice was suddenly dangerous. "Who told you?" She laughed in delight at his reaction. "Someone who recognized you." "Who? This is serious, Rosemary." "My wicked cousin, Victor Drake." "I've never met him." "He probably wasn't using that name when you knew him." "I expect he had chosen to give a false one in order to save the family embarrassment," Anthony said slowly. "I see. So, you mean that we met in prison then?" "Yes. I saw Victor recently, and I was telling him what a disgrace to the family he was when he grinned and said, 'You aren't so perfect yourself, sweetheart. I saw you last night dancing with a chap who calls himself Anthony Brown. In prison, we knew him as Tony Morelli.'" Anthony smiled. "Well, I'd like to see him again. We ex-prisoners must stick together." "You're too late. He sailed to South America yesterday." "So you're the only person now who knows my guilty secret?" Rosemary nodded. "And I won't tell." "You had better not. You don't want your pretty face slashed, do you? There are people around who are very happy to ruin a girl's beauty. And murder doesn't only happen in books and films, it happens in real life too." "Are you threatening me, Tony?" "I'm warning you. Forget the name Tony Morelli. Do you understand? But I don't mind, Tony. It's exciting to meet a criminal. You shouldn't be ashamed." He looked at her coldly, wondering how he could ever have cared for her. She was just a silly girl with a pretty face. He would have to leave. He couldn't trust her to keep his secret. She smiled her enchanting smile. Don't look so fierce. Will you take me to the Jarrows dance next week? I won't be here. I'm going away. Not before my birthday party. You can't. I've been very ill, and you mustn't upset me. You must come. He was going to refuse, but at that moment, through the open parlour door, he saw Iris Marle coming down the stairs, tall and slim, with dark hair and grey eyes. And Anthony Brown changed his mind. Chapter 4. Stephen Faraday. From an early age, Stephen Faraday had been determined to succeed in life. He was a quiet, well-behaved boy who worked hard enough at school to earn a place at Oxford University. He graduated at the age of 22, leaving his college with a reputation as a clever public speaker, a talent for writing newspaper articles, some useful friends, and an ambition to work in politics. Naturally shy, he worked hard to develop an excellent social manner, with the occasional flash of brilliance, and soon people began to say, "That young man will go far." He joined the Conservative Party and was quickly elected to a parliamentary seat. As he triumphantly entered the House of Commons for the first time, Stephen knew he had chosen the right career. However, he soon realised that he was a very unimportant member of the government. How could he rise to a higher position? People didn't trust young politicians, so he needed something more than his own talents to help him. He needed the help of a powerful political family. Marriage was the answer, he decided. Marriage to a well-connected woman who would share his life and his ambitions, who would give him children and be proud of his success. One day he was invited to a party at Kidderminster House in Mayfair. The Kidderminsters were one of the most powerful political families in England. Lord and Lady Kidderminster had 5 daughters, 3 of them beautiful. Stephen was leaning beside a window about 20 minutes after arriving at the party when he noticed a tall, fair girl standing by the refreshment table, looking rather lost. He recognised her as Lady Alexandra Hale, the least attractive of the Kidderminsters' 5 daughters. She did not have the same style and confidence as her prettier sisters, and he could see that she was shy and uncomfortable. Suddenly, Stephen recognised his chance. He walked across to stand beside her at the table and picked up a sandwich. Then, turning to her, he said, "Do you mind if I talk to you? I don't know many people here, and I can see you don't either." As he had guessed, the girl was too embarrassed to tell him who she really was. They began talking together. Stephen mentioned a play which she had also seen, dealing with some aspect of the social services. Soon they were deep in a discussion about politics. Stephen was careful not to overdo things. When he saw Lady Kidderminster entering the room looking for her daughter, he said goodbye and left the party. He did not want to be introduced to her just yet. For several days afterwards, he watched Kidderminster House, waiting for the chance to see Lady Alexandra alone. His patience was rewarded one morning when she came out with a small dog and walked towards Hyde Park. Stephen hurried ahead so that when Sandra entered through the park gates, he was already walking along the path towards her. As they passed one another, he stopped in delighted surprise. "I say, what luck! I wondered if I'd ever see you again. I didn't tell you my name the other day. I'm Stephen Faraday, an unimportant member of Parliament. She blushed and said, I'm Alexandra, Sandra, Haley. His reaction was perfectly judged. Surprise, embarrassment, dismay. Lady Alexandra, oh dear, you must have thought I was so rude at the party. I should have known. It doesn't matter, Mr. Faraday, she reassured him quickly. Please don't be upset. Why don't we walk down to the river? After that, they often met in the park. They discussed politics, and he discovered that she was an intelligent and sympathetic woman. They became friends, and soon Stephen was invited to dinner at Kidderminster House. That evening he made a good impression on Lord and Lady Kidderminster, who described him as a useful young man to know. 2 months later, Stephen proposed to Sandra. Sandra, I love you, and I want you to marry me. I believe that I shall be a very successful man one day. You won't be ashamed of your choice, I promise. I'm not ashamed. Then you do care for me, darling. Didn't you know? I had hoped, but I wasn't sure. I've loved you since I first saw you across the room and came over to speak to you. I was never more terrified in my life. I think I loved you then too. Sandra's parents were not happy that she wanted to marry a man from an ordinary family who held an unimportant parliamentary position, but Lord Kidderminster knew his quiet daughter's determined nature. If she wanted Faraday, she would have him. The fellow has got a promising career ahead of him, he admitted, and the Conservative Party could certainly do with some young and talented new members. Lady Kidderminster agreed reluctantly. Then we will have to help him. So, Alexandra Hale married Stephen Faraday, and they moved into a charming house in Westminster. Soon afterwards, Sandra's godmother died and left her a delightful old house in the country called Fairhaven. Stephen returned to Parliament with new energy. His connection with the Kidderminsters promised him a rapid rise in his career, and his wife was the perfect partner he had imagined, his ideal companion. Life was turning out just as he had planned. At 32, success already lay within his reach. And then the Faradays took a holiday in St. Moritz, a skiing resort in the Swiss Alps, and Stephen saw Rosemary Barton across the hotel lounge, and the lie he had told to his wife became the truth at last. Across a room he fell deeply, crazily, desperately in love. He had always believed that he was not a passionate man. Sensual pleasure held little interest for him, so to fall in love like an inexperienced boy was a terrible shock. He could think of nothing but Rosemary's lovely face, her red gold hair, her perfect figure. He couldn't eat or sleep. They went skiing together, danced together, and as he held her in his arms, he wanted her more than anything on earth. 2 weeks after they returned to London, he became Rosemary's lover. Their mad affair lasted for 6 months. Stephen worked at the House of Commons, spoke at political meetings, and thought only of Rosemary. Their secret meetings, her warm embrace. It was a sensual, feverish dream, and after the dream, the sudden awakening. It was like coming out of a tunnel into daylight. One day he was a passionate lover. The next day he was Stephen Faraday again, thinking that perhaps they shouldn't meet quite so often. They had taken some serious risks. What if Sandra guessed the truth? Some of his excuses for absence lately had been pretty weak. Most women would have become suspicious by now. He needed to escape. He took a few days off work and went down to Fairhaven with Sandra. It was peaceful, sitting in the gardens with his wife, playing golf, walking in the countryside. He felt like he was recovering from an illness. He had told Rosemary not to write to him in Sussex. It was too dangerous, even though Sandra never asked him who his letters were from. So, when he recognized Rosemary's writing on an envelope at the breakfast table, he frowned in annoyance and took it into his study to read. Over several pages, Rosemary had written that she adored him, loved him more than ever, couldn't bear not to see him for 5 whole days. He thought that it was sweet of her to write, but she shouldn't have done it. Why couldn't she wait until he got back to London? Another letter arrived the next morning. This time Stephen thought Sandra's eyes rested on it for a couple of seconds, but she didn't say anything. After breakfast, he drove to the nearest town to call Rosemary from a public telephone box. "Hello, Rosemary." "Stephen, darling." "Oh, I have missed you." "Have you missed me?" "Yes, of course. But don't write to me anymore. It's not safe." "Don't be silly, darling. What does it matter?" "I'm thinking of you too, Rosemary." "Oh, I don't care what happens to me." "Well, I care, sweetheart." "When are you coming back?" "Tuesday." "Can't you make an excuse and come up today?" "I'm afraid it isn't possible." When Stephen rang off, he felt exhausted. Rosemary and he must be more careful in future. After that, things began to get difficult. Stephen was working so hard that it was impossible to give much time to Rosemary. But she didn't understand. She wasn't interested in his career. She just wanted him to tell her again and again that he loved her. Surely, he thought, she must know that by now. She made sudden, impossible demands. Couldn't he go down to the south of France and she could meet him there? One of those places where you never saw anyone you knew. Stephen said that there was no such place in the world. At the most unlikely spots, you always met some old school friend that you hadn't seen for years. "Well, it wouldn't really matter, would it?" she said. He felt suddenly cold. "What do you mean?" She smiled at him. "Darling, it's stupid to go on trying to keep this a secret, so let's stop pretending. George will divorce me and your wife will divorce you, and then we can get married." Disaster. Ruin. "I wouldn't let you do such a thing," he said. "But darling, it doesn't matter what other people think of us." "It matters to me, my dear. A scandal of that kind would destroy my career." "But there are hundreds of other things that you could do. And you don't need to do anything anyway. I've got lots of money of my own. We could travel the world." Who on earth did she think he was? At that moment, the spell was finally broken. Rosemary had a beautiful face and the brains of a chicken. And if Stephen wasn't careful, she would ruin his life. He said the things that men always say in these situations. They must end it for her sake. He couldn't risk bringing unhappiness on her, but she had replied that she adored him. She couldn't live without him. They must tell the truth. She would tell George, and George would divorce her. Sandra would divorce Stephen too. He had no doubt about that. and his career would not survive the scandal. Everything ruined because of his lust for a silly woman. He would lose everything. He would lose Sandra. With a shock of surprise, Stephen realized that losing Sandra was his greatest fear. His dear, loyal Sandra. No, somehow he must keep Rosemary quiet. "I won't do anything until after my birthday," Rosemary had said. "It would be too cruel. Dear George is making such a fuss about it." But if Stephen told her clearly that he no longer loved her, she might very well go to George in hysterics. She might even go to Sandra. He could hear Rosemary saying tearfully, "He says he doesn't care anymore, but he's just being loyal to you. I know you'll agree that when people love each other, honesty is the only way. So I'm asking you to give him his freedom." And Sandra would free him. She wouldn't believe that Stephen truly loved her. How could she, if Rosemary showed her the letters he had been stupid enough to write? He had never written such letters to Sandra. "It's a pity that we don't live in the days of the Borgias," he thought. A glass of poisoned champagne was about the only thing that would keep Rosemary quiet. And then, a week later, there was cyanide in Rosemary's champagne glass. And across the table, his eyes met Sandra's. Chapter 5. Alexandra Faraday. Sandra Faraday had loved Stephen from the moment he first spoke to her at Kidderminster House, pretending not to know who she was. She had realized that he had known, soon after their marriage. One day, when he was describing a clever piece of political strategy, she had recognized the same tactics he had used to win her. She had always accepted that he did not love her in the same fierce way that she loved him. She thought that he wasn't actually capable of it, but she understood the job he wanted her to do. He needed her practical help, her brains and her connections. He didn't want her heart, but she knew that he liked her and enjoyed her company. So she hid her passionate devotion from him and looked forward to a future full of friendship and affection. And then Stephen met Rosemary Barton in St. Moritz. Sandra wondered how he could imagine that she didn't know about them. She had known from the moment he first looked at the woman. She had known the very day the woman became his mistress. She knew the perfume the woman used. Her pride had protected her. She would never show that she was hurt, never beg, never protest. And she had one small piece of comfort. Stephen didn't want to leave her. She knew that it was only for the sake of his career, but he wouldn't leave. And someday, the affair would end. Never for 1 minute did Sandra think of leaving him. Stephen was her life, her whole existence. What did he see in the girl? She was very beautiful, but she was also brainless, silly and stupid. Sandra believed that Stephen would get tired of Rosemary in time. His main interest in life was his work. He had a fine political brain and was destined for great things. Surely once the attraction began to fade, he would remember that fact. When they went down to Fairhaven, Stephen had seemed more like himself, and hope rose in her heart. He still wanted her close to him and asked for her advice. For the moment he had escaped from that woman. If only he would end the affair. Then they went back to London and it all began again. Stephen looked tired and ill. He couldn't concentrate on his work. Sandra thought she knew why. He was deciding to destroy everything he cared about most. It was madness. But Stephen would not be the first man who had sacrificed his career for a beautiful woman and been sorry afterwards. How beautiful Rosemary had looked that night at Luxembourg, as she stood before the mirror in the ladies' cloakroom, fixing her makeup. She looked thin and pale after her recent illness. "Oh, this horrid flu has exhausted me," she exclaimed. "I look awful, and I still feel weak and headachy. You haven't got an aspirin, have you, Sandra?" "No, but I've got a sachet of headache powder." Sandra had taken the paper packet from her handbag and given it to Rosemary, just as Ruth Lessing came up to take her place at the mirror. Then they had gone out to join the men in the hall: Sandra, Rosemary, Ruth Lessing, and Rosemary's sister Iris. As they walked into the dining room, there had been no warning that one of them would never go through that doorway again, alive. Chapter 6. George Barton. George Barton had always been crazy about Rosemary, but when he asked her to marry him, he thought she would just laugh at him. After all, he knew she didn't love him. To his amazement, however, she accepted his offer. "I know I will feel settled and happy and safe with you. I'm sick of being in love. It always goes wrong. I like you, George. You're funny and sweet, and you think I'm wonderful. That's what I want." Amazed and delighted by her unexpected decision, George had answered unsteadily, "We'll be as happy as kings." And they had been happy. George had always known that Rosemary wouldn't be content with a dull man like him, that she would have affairs, but he knew that she would always come back to him. Her affection for him existed quite separately from her love affairs. He had not minded her flirtations with various young men, but when she began a serious affair, he discovered that it was a different matter. He had known immediately, sensing her excitement, and on the day when he had gone into her sitting room and she had quickly covered up the letter she was writing, he had guessed she was writing to her lover. When she left the room, taking the letter with her, he crossed to the desk and picked up the blotting paper she had used to dry the ink on the page. He had held it up to the mirror on the wall and read the words, "My own beloved darling." A wave of anger had swept over him. Who was it? That fellow Brown? Or Stephen Faraday? They had both been flirting with her. He had caught sight of his reflection in the mirror. His eyes were red. He looked as if he was about to collapse. Well, he would never suffer like that again. Rosemary had been dead for nearly a year now, and so they were both at peace, and it was time to concentrate on his plan. He would speak to Colonel Race first and see what he thought of the anonymous letters. And then he had it all worked out. The date, November 2nd, which was All Souls' Day. That was a clever detail. The place, the Luxembourg, the same table and the same guests: Anthony Brown, Stephen and Sandra Faraday, Ruth, Iris, and himself. He would also invite Race, who had been invited to the original dinner but had been unable to attend. And there would also be one extra empty place. It was late October, and at Little Priors, George Barton's country house, Lucilla Drake was busily organising the family's return from Sussex to London for the winter. As she considered the many housekeeping matters that must be managed, she looked worriedly across at Iris, who was resting on a sofa. The girl seemed pale and tired. My dear, you look as though you haven't slept. You're black under the eyes. I think the air here is unhealthy. This house is in a hollow. If George had consulted me instead of Miss Lessing, it's a great mistake to encourage her to think herself one of the family. But Aunt, Ruth is practically one of the family, Mrs. Drake sniffed. She intends to be, that's quite clear, but that's unacceptable. George must be protected, and I think you should tell him that marriage to Miss Lessing is out of the question. Iris was surprised. I had never thought of George marrying Ruth. Wouldn't it be rather nice? I think she would make him a very good wife. George is very well looked after already. I am perfectly able to see to his comfort and his health. What does a young woman out of an office know about housekeeping? Iris smiled. Poor Aunt Lucilla. Romance was so far back in the past for her now that she had probably forgotten what it meant, if indeed it had ever meant much. Lucilla had been the half-sister of Iris and Rosemary's father, Hector. She was nearly 40 when she met and married the elderly Reverend Caleb Drake, who died 2 years later, leaving her with a baby son. Being a mother had been the greatest experience of Lucilla Drake's life. Her son Victor had turned out to be a problem, but she refused to see anything wrong in him except a slight weakness of character. She thought her dear boy was too trusting, too easily influenced by bad friends. He was unlucky. He was too innocent and therefore deceived by wicked men. She knew how much Victor hated asking her for money. But when the poor boy was really in trouble, who else could he ask? George's invitation to come and live with him and Iris had come at a moment when she had been in danger of real poverty. She had been happy and comfortable with them and did not like the thought of being replaced by a young woman who, she believed, would only be marrying George for his money. Thank goodness there was at least one person who could see what Ruth Lessing was planning to do. I wish they had never come to Little Priors, Sandra exclaimed bitterly as George and Iris left Fairfield after having lunch with the Faradays. Stephen turned to look at her in surprise. I didn't know you felt like that about them too, he said. Neighbours are different in the country. You have to be either friends or enemies. You can't just see people occasionally as you can in London. And so now we've got to go to this extraordinary party. They were both silent, remembering the scene at lunch where George Barton's behaviour had been noticeably strange. He had been extremely friendly, but there had been a clear undercurrent of excitement in him. And then, that sudden, unexpected invitation. A party for Iris's 18th birthday. He did hope the Faradays would both come. Stephen and Sandra had been so kind to them here in Sussex. He had insisted on setting the date right then. I thought perhaps one day, the week after next, Wednesday, or Thursday. Thursday is November 2nd. Would that be all right? But we'll arrange any day that suits you both. It was an invitation that you couldn't politely refuse. Stephen had noticed Iris Marle blushing with embarrassment as Sandra smilingly accepted and said that Thursday, November 2nd would suit them very well. Now, voicing his thoughts, Stephen said sharply, "We don't have to go. We can make some excuse." Sandra turned to look at him. "He'll just change the date. He seems very anxious for us to come." "I can't think why. It's Iris's party, and I doubt she particularly wants us there." "No?" Sandra sounded thoughtful. You know this party is to be at the Luxembourg. But that's ridiculous. He was shocked. The man must be mad. We will certainly refuse to go. The whole thing with Rosemary's death was terribly unpleasant. The publicity, the pictures in the papers. Doesn't he realize how disagreeable it would be for us? George told me his reasons, Stephen. He said that Iris has avoided the Luxembourg ever since that night. But he consulted a psychiatrist who said that after a bad shock, the cause of the trouble must be faced, not avoided. George believes it would help Iris forget all her unhappy memories if he planned a pleasant party at the same restaurant with, as far as possible, the same guests at the table. How delightful, Stephen observed ironically. He was horrified by the thought. Do you really mind, Stephen? I think it's a rather nasty idea. But if you don't mind, I do mind very much. But George made it impossible to refuse. You don't have to go. I'll go and you can cancel at the last minute with a headache or something. Sandra lifted her chin. That would be cowardly. No, Stephen. If you go, I go. After all, she laid her hand on his arm. However little our marriage means, it should at least mean sharing our difficulties. He stared her in horror. Why do you say that? However little our marriage means? She looked back at him calmly. Well, isn't it true? No, 1,000 times no. Our marriage means everything to me. She smiled. I suppose we do make a good partnership, don't we? Of course we do, but that's not what I meant. Stephen was finding it hard to breathe. He took her hand in both of his, holding it very tightly. Sandra, he said shakily, don't you know that you mean the world to me? Then, suddenly she was in his arms and he was holding her close and kissing her. Sandra, darling, I love you. I've been so afraid I would lose you. Because of Rosemary? She asked. Yes. He let her go and stepped back, ashamed. You knew? Of course. And you understand? She shook her head. Number, I don't think I ever will. Did you love her? Not really. It was you I loved. From the first moment you saw me across the room, she reminded him, suddenly angry. Don't repeat that lie, for it was a lie. He answered thoughtfully. Yes, it was, but I'm beginning to believe that it was actually true. You were not in love with me, she said bitterly. I had never been in love. I was a passionless man. I was even proud of my emotional control. And then I did fall in love, across a room, in St. Moritz. It was a silly, violent love like a summer storm, brief, unreal, and quickly over. He paused. It was here, at Fairhaven, that I realized that your love was the only thing in life that mattered to me. I thought you were planning to go away with her. With Rosemary? He gave a short laugh. That would have been penal servitude for life. Didn't she want you to go away with her? Yes, she did. What happened? Stephen drew a deep breath. The Luxembourg happened. They both fell silent, remembering. Then Sandra asked, What are we going to do? We'll face it together, said Stephen, and go to this horrible party, whatever George's reason for it may be. You don't believe his story about Iris? No, do you? It could be true, but it's not the real reason. What do you think this party is, Sandra? She met his eyes. I think it's a trap. On the way back from lunch with the Faradays at Fairfield, Iris turned to George. "Do you mind if I go for a walk? I've got an awful headache." "My poor child, of course. I won't come with you, though. I have a friend coming to visit me this afternoon." "Right then. Goodbye till tea time." Iris walked away through a wood and up a nearby hill. When she reached the top, she stopped and sat down on a fallen tree. The October afternoon was damp, and grey clouds promised more rain. She was looking down into the valley when she heard a slight rustle in the trees behind her. Looking round, she saw Anthony Brown walking towards her. "Tony," she cried, "how did you know where I was?" He sat down and took out his cigarette case. "I have an excellent pair of binoculars. I knew you were having lunch with the Faradays, so I spied on you from the hillside and followed you when you left." He smiled and lit his cigarette. "Why didn't you come to the house like an ordinary person?" "I'm not an ordinary person," said Anthony in a shocked tone. "I'm very extraordinary." "I think you are." He looked at her quickly. Then he said, "Is anything the matter?" "No." "At least," she drew a deep breath, "I hate being down here. I want to go back to London." "You're going soon, aren't you?" "Next week." "So this was a farewell party at the Faradays?" "It wasn't a party, just lunch." "Do you like the Faradays?" "Not very much, although they've been very nice to us. Stephen always seems to me rather arrogant and stupid." "He's not stupid. He's just one of the usual unhappy successes." "Unhappy? Most successes are unhappy. That's why they are successes. They have to reassure themselves about who they are by achieving something that the world will notice. The happy people are failures because they are so content in themselves that they don't care what other people think. Like me. They are also usually very pleasant company. Again, like me." "You have a very good opinion of yourself." "I'm just drawing attention to my good points in case you haven't noticed them." Iris laughed, suddenly feeling much happier. She glanced at her watch. "Come and have tea, and give a few more people the benefit of your pleasant company." Anthony shook his head. "I can't stay long." "Why will you never come to the house?" she demanded. "There must be a reason." Anthony shrugged his shoulders. "George doesn't like me." "Why are you here then? Do you have business in this part of the world?" "Very important business. With you." "I came to ask you a question, Iris." His eyes were very serious. "Do you trust me? It's the most important question in the world to me. Do you trust me?" After a brief moment, she answered, "Yes." "Then will you come up to London now and marry me without telling anybody?" She stared at him. "I couldn't." "You do love me, don't you?" "Yes, Anthony," she heard herself say. "But you won't come and marry me by special license at the Church of St. Elfrida in Bloomsbury?" "I can't. George would be so hurt, and Aunt Lucilla would never forgive me. And I'm not old enough anyway. I'm only 18. I can't marry without legal consent until I'm 21. "You'd have to lie about your age." "But why? What's the point of it?" "You have to trust my reasons. Let's say that it is the simplest way, but never mind," Iris said fearfully. "If George only knew you a little better. Come back with me now. It will only be him and Aunt Lucilla." "Are you sure? I thought I saw a man going up your drive, and I believe I recognized him as someone I had met." "Oh yes, I forgot. George was expecting someone. The man I thought I saw was a man called Colonel Race. It's very likely, Iris agreed. George does know a Colonel Race. He was coming to dinner on that night when Rosemary... She broke off and drew a deep breath. Anthony, did you ever think that Rosemary might not have committed suicide? That she might have been murdered? Good heavens, Iris, certainly not. What put such a thought into your head? She wanted to tell him the incredible story of George's anonymous letters, but instead she said slowly, "It was just an idea." Well, forget it, my darling. He pulled her to her feet and kissed her lightly on the cheek. Colonel Race was a tall, military-looking man in his 60s with a tanned face, short grey hair, and intelligent dark eyes. Race was 20 years older than George Barton, who he had known ever since George was a boy. They were not particularly close friends. Race was an outdoors type of man who had spent most of his life abroad, working for British intelligence, while George was definitely a city gentleman. At this moment, Race was wondering just why young George had asked him to come down to see him in Sussex. George had always been a cautious, practical, sensible man, but this afternoon he seemed very nervous. Race took his pipe out of his mouth and looked across at George. "So, young George, what's the trouble?" "I need your advice, Race, and your help. Almost a year ago, you were invited to dine with us in London at the Luxembourg, but you had to go abroad at the last minute." Race nodded. "To South Africa. At that dinner party, my wife died. I know. I read about it. Didn't mention it now or offer you sympathy because I didn't want to upset you, but I am sorry you know that." "Oh, yes, but that's not the point. My wife was supposed to have committed suicide." Race's eyebrows rose. "Supposed? Read these." George handed the 2 letters to Race. "Anonymous letters. Who do you think wrote them, George?" "I don't know. I don't care. But I believe they're true. My wife was murdered." Race put down his pipe. "Did you suspect this at the time? Did the police?" "No, I just accepted the verdict. There was no suggestion of anything except suicide. The cyanide was in her handbag, so it seemed at the time quite straightforward." Had she ever threatened to commit suicide? Never. Rosemary loved life. Race had only met George's wife once. He had thought her beautiful but stupid, but not depressive. What was the medical evidence as to her state of mind? Rosemary's own doctor was away on holiday at the time. His partner looked after Rosemary when she had the influenza, and he said it could cause serious depression. Later, Rosemary's own doctor told me that he was very surprised at what had happened. Rosemary was not the suicidal type, he said. George paused. It was then that I realized how unlikely Rosemary's suicide was. She could certainly get very emotional about things, and she would sometimes act without thinking. But I have never known her want to abandon life completely. What's more, if Rosemary had wanted to kill herself, she would never have done it that way. It was painful and ugly. An overdose of sleeping medicine would be far more likely. I agree. Was there any evidence as to how she obtained the cyanide? No. But she had been staying with friends in the country, and they had used cyanide to destroy a wasp's nest there one day. It was thought that she might have taken some then. So there was no natural disposition to commit suicide, nor any preparation for it. But there can't have been any evidence for murder, or the police would have found it. They're quite clever, you know. Just the idea of murder would have seemed incredible then. But it didn't seem so to you 6 months later, George said slowly. I think I must have been subconsciously unsatisfied all along. So when I saw the thing written down, it made sense at once. Race nodded. So, who do you suspect? George looked ill. If Rosemary was killed, one of those people at the table, one of our friends, must have done it. No one else came near us. Who poured the wine? Charles, the head waiter at the Luxembourg. Everybody knew Charles. It was impossible to imagine that he would deliberately poison a client. And the waiter who served us was Giuseppe, who always looks after me there. He's a delightful fellow. So who was at the dinner party? Stephen Faraday, the MP. His wife, Lady Alexandra. My secretary, Ruth Lessing. A fellow called Anthony Brown. Rosemary's sister Iris and myself. There should have been 8 guests. But when you cancelled, we couldn't think of anybody else to ask at the last minute. Where were you all sitting? I had Sandra Faraday on my right. Anthony Brown sat next to her. Then Rosemary, Stephen, Iris, and Ruth Lessing, who sat on my left. Had your wife drunk champagne earlier in the evening? Yes. The glasses had been filled up several times. It happened while we were all watching the cabaret show. Rosemary collapsed just before the lights were turned up again. The doctor said that death must have been almost immediate. Well, when you first consider it, the murderer seems obvious. Stephen Faraday was on her right. Her champagne glass would be close to his left hand. It would be simple to drop the poison in as soon as the lights were turned down and people were watching the show. Those Luxembourg tables are big, and I don't think anybody else could have leaned across the table without being noticed, even if it was dark. Even the man on Rosemary's left would have needed to lean across her to put anything in her glass. There is one other possibility, but we'll take Faraday first. Is there any reason why he would want to kill your wife? George answered unwillingly. They had been close friends. If Rosemary had rejected him, he might have wanted revenge. Race looked at his red face and continued. Possibility number 2 is that it was one of the women. Why? In a party of 7, with 4 women and 3 men, there will be times during the evening when 3 couples are dancing and 1 woman is left sitting alone at the table. Did you all get up to dance? Yes. Before the cabaret, can you remember who was sitting alone at any moment? George thought. Yes. Iris was left out the last time, and Ruth the time before. When did your wife last drink champagne? Let me see, she had been dancing with Brown, who is rather an energetic dancer. I remember her coming back quite thirsty and finishing the champagne in her glass. Then they played a waltz, and she danced with me. Faraday danced with Ruth, and Lady Alexandra with Brown. Iris stayed at the table. Immediately after that, it was the cabaret. Did Iris inherit any money on your wife's death? My dear Race, don't be absurd. Iris was devoted to Rosemary. Never mind. She had the opportunity, and I want to know if she had the motive. Your wife was a rich woman. Did her money go to you? No, It went to Iris, in trust, until she's 21. He explained Paul Bennett's will. The rich sister and the poor sister, Race observed. Some girls might have resented that. I'm sure Iris didn't. Maybe not, but she certainly had a motive. Who else did? Nobody. Rosemary didn't have an enemy in the world. I've been asking questions, trying to find out. I've even taken this house near the Faradays so as to... He stopped. Race picked up his pipe and began to clean it out. You had better tell me, George. What do you mean? You're hiding something. You can protect your wife's name, or you can try to find out if she was murdered. But you can't do both. All right, said George unhappily. Did your wife have a lover? Yes. Was it Stephen Faraday? I don't know. It could have been him or Brown. I couldn't tell. Tell me about Anthony Brown. I think I have heard the name before. He's a good-looking, amusing chap, but nobody knows anything about him. He's supposed to be American, but he doesn't have much of an accent. And you've no idea which of them it was? No. I found her writing a love letter to someone, and I examined the blotting paper afterwards. But there was no name. Well, Lady Alexandra has a motive if her husband was having an affair with your wife, and so do Brown and Faraday if they were having affairs they wanted to end. And so does Iris, because of the money. What about Ruth Lessing, your secretary? What sort of a girl is she? She's the dearest girl in the world, practically one of the family. I depend upon her in every way. Race made no comment, but mentally noted a definite motive for Ruth Lessing, an ambition to become the second Mrs. Barton. Whether she wanted her employer's money, or she was genuinely in love with him, the dearest girl in the world had a very definite reason for wanting the removal of Rosemary Barton. I suppose it's occurred to you, George, he said gently, that you had a rather good motive yourself. George looked horrified. No, it wasn't like that between me and Rosemary. I adored her, and she was very fond of me, but I always knew I would have to accept her love affairs. It hurt when it happened, but I would never have harmed her, and anyway, if I had done it, why would I stir things up again after a verdict of suicide was passed? It would be madness. Absolutely. I don't seriously suspect you, my dear chap. A successful murderer who got letters like these would just put them quietly in the fire. So, who does want to stir things up again? Who do you think wrote those letters, George? Servants? Said George uncertainly. If so, what servants, and what do they know? Did Rosemary have her own maid? At the time we had a cook, Mrs. Pound, who is still with us, and a couple of maids who have both left since then. Well, now, Barton, think very carefully. Rosemary is dead. You can't bring her back. Do you really want to know if she was murdered? It may mean a lot of unpleasant publicity. Your wife's love affairs will be common knowledge. I want the truth, cried George. Well, in that case, you must take these letters to the police. I'm not going to the police. I'm going to set a trap for the murderer. I'm going to have a party at the Luxembourg, and I want you to come, Race. The same guests will be there. The Faradays, Brown, Ruth, Iris, and myself. What are you going to do? George laughed. That's my secret. I want you to come and see what happens. Race spoke sharply. George, these dramatic gestures don't work. Go to the police. They're professionals. So are you. That's why I want you there. Because I've worked for the Secret Service. Ray shook his head. I'm sorry, but I don't like your plan and I won't play. Give it up, George. There's a good man. It won't work and it could be dangerous. It will be dangerous for somebody, all right. Ray sighed. Oh, well, don't say I haven't warned you. The morning of November 2nd was wet and gloomy. Iris sat at the dining room table pushing uneaten food around her plate. George read his newspaper while Lucilla wept into a handkerchief. Victor wouldn't say it was a matter of life and death if it wasn't, she wailed. I've said I'll see to it, Lucilla, snapped George. I know, but a delay might be fatal. Your inquiries will take time, and he says he needs the money without fail by the 3rd, which is tomorrow. Don't worry, Aunt, said Iris. George will fix it. He always does. George got up and patted Mrs. Drake kindly on the back as he walked past her chair. Cheer up, my dear. I'll get Ruth to send a telegram immediately. Iris followed him out into the hall. George, shall we cancel the party tonight? Aunt Lucilla is so upset. Shouldn't we stay at home with her? Certainly not. Why should that damned villain upset our lives? It's blackmail and Lucilla's a fool. If Victor had been forced to save himself from disaster just once, it would have done him a great deal of good. But I'll get something arranged before tonight so that she can go to bed happy. As he walked out of the front door, the hall telephone rang and Iris went over to answer it. Hello? Anthony. She smiled in delight. The man himself. Have you been talking to George? What do you mean? Well, he insisted I come to your birthday party tonight. I thought perhaps you had something to do with it. No. What's the matter, darling? I can hear you sighing through the telephone. It's nothing. Tell me, my sweet. I can't. I'll see you tonight, then. I suppose George knows what he's doing, but it seems madness to me. They said goodbye and ended the call, and Iris returned to the dining room to reassure her aunt. George arrived at his office and sent for Ruth Lessing at once. Trouble again, Ruth? Look, he said as she arrived. She took the telegram he held out. Victor Drake? Yes. Unfortunately, it is from him. Wasn't it a year ago that we sent him to Buenos Aires? It was October 27th. Ruth had a good reason for remembering. It was after returning from her meeting with Victor Drake that she had listened to Rosemary's careless voice on the telephone and realized that she hated her. We're lucky that he's lasted as long as he has out there, George observed. £300 is a lot of money. Oh, he won't get that much. We'll make the usual investigations. Send Ogilvy a telegram. Alexander Ogilvy was George's business agent in Buenos Aires. I'll do it at once. Ruth returned to George's office after lunch with bad news. I'm afraid that Victor has been stealing money. Mr. Ogilvy has just telephoned to say that the senior partner in the firm has agreed not to prosecute Victor if he repays the money. The sum is £165. So Victor was hoping to profit by £135? I'm afraid so. I told Mr. Ogilvy to go ahead and pay the money back. Was that right? Personally, I would be happy to send him to prison, but we must consider his mother. So Master Victor wins as usual. You're a very good man, said Ruth. Pleased and embarrassed, he picked up her hand and kissed it. Dearest Ruth. What would I do without you? George sighed with relief. They were all here drinking cocktails in the Luxembourg, safe in his trap. Stephen Faraday, tall and stiff. Sandra Faraday in a black velvet gown and an emerald necklace. Ruth, also wearing black, her dark hair smooth and shining. Iris, pale and silent, in a simple green dress. And Anthony Brown, the last to arrive. Now the play could begin. They finished their drinks, and Charles, the head waiter, led them to a group of 3 tables in the far corner of the room. There was a large one in the middle and a small one on each side. A foreign-looking man and a fair-haired woman were sitting at one of the small tables. Another couple, a young man and his girlfriend, sat at the other. The large table was reserved for Barton's party. George organised their seats. Sandra, you sit here on my right. Brown next to Sandra. Iris on my left, then Faraday, then Ruth. Between Ruth and Anthony was an empty chair. The table had been laid for 7. Colonel Race may be late. He said we shouldn't wait for him. Iris was sure George had deliberately separated her from Anthony. Clearly, he still didn't trust him. She looked across the table and saw that Anthony was frowning at the empty chair beside him. "I'm glad you've got another man, Barton," he said. "I may have to leave early. I've seen a man here that I know." George smiled. "Mixing business with pleasure, Brown? Not that I've ever known exactly what your business is," Anthony replied coolly. "Organised crime, Barton. Robberies arranged. Families visited at their private addresses." Sandra Faraday laughed. "No, you're something to do with armaments, aren't you?" Anthony glanced at her in surprise. "You mustn't betray my secrets, Lady Alexandra. There are spies everywhere." As the waiter removed their oyster plates, Stephen asked Iris to dance. Soon everyone was dancing and the party became more lively. At last, it was Iris's turn to dance with Anthony. "It's mean of George not to let us sit together," she said. "Not at all. This way I can gaze at you across the table." "Do you really have to go early?" "I'm afraid so." When they returned to the table, there was a change in the atmosphere. All the guests seemed to feel the nervous tension in the air. Iris saw George glance at his watch. Suddenly, the band started to play, and the cabaret show began. As the restaurant lights were turned off, 3 pairs of professional dancers entered and performed on the lighted stage in the center of the room. Then a comedian did an act, and after that there was a display by a pair of acrobats. As the restaurant lights were switched back on at the end, a wave of relief passed over the Barton table, as though they had been expecting something to happen, which had not. A year ago the lights had turned back on to show Rosemary lying dead across the table. Now at last, the shadow of tragedy had lifted. Cheerful conversations began all around the table. Only George sat staring blankly at the empty place opposite him. Iris nudged him. "Come and dance with me, George." He shook himself and, smiling, raised his glass. "Let's drink a toast to the young lady whose birthday we're celebrating. Iris Marle." They raised their glasses and drank, and then they got up to dance. George and Iris, Stephen and Ruth, Anthony and Sandra. When the dance ended, they all returned, laughing and talking. Suddenly, George leaned forward. "A year ago, we were here on an evening that ended in tragedy. I don't want to recall past sadness, but I don't want to feel that Rosemary is completely forgotten. So I'll ask you to drink to her memory." He lifted his glass. "To Rosemary." They all raised their glasses and drank the toast. There was a moment's pause, and then George fell sideways in his chair, his hands at his throat, fighting for breath. It took him a minute and a half to die.